What's going on, guys? Greg Ehrenberg from Stochastic here, and I'm about to talk about Saturday's UFC card main event, Marvin Vettori taking on Jared Cannonier. And hopefully I don't screw this up. This is my third attempt to record this, so if you guys could do me a favor, like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. The first time I was trying to record this, I didn't hit the record button, which is always problematic. Second time I tried to record it, I didn't pull the stats up on the screen. So I'm referencing the stats, I'm highlighting them, and then there was nothing on the screen here to show you guys. So I got halfway through the video and realized I screwed up twice. So third time is the charm. I'm going to nail it here. But like I said, do me a favor, like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Shout out to DraftKings Rainmakers who are sponsoring the show today. They have an offer where if you guys are checking out Rainmakers for the first time, you get a totally free starters pack for PGA, and you get to pick a stud golfer like John Rahm or Scotty Scheffler to help start your collection there. And there's no reason to not take advantage because it is totally free. We've got a link for that right below for you guys to check out. I'm going to be covering this slate from a few different angles, my favorite DraftKings plays, my favorite Rainmakers plays, and obviously those are going to be correlated a little bit. And then also, I'm going to walk you through some bets that I like for this card. But let's start with the main event, Marvin Vettori against Jared Cannonier. And considering where these two are priced on DraftKings, $8,000 for Marvin Vettori, $8,200 for Jared Cannonier, and also the fact that this is a main event with 5 rounds to work with, I do think this is a pretty good fight to target. My lean is going to be on the Marvin Vettori side for a few reasons that I'm about to walk through right now. In addition, I don't mind a bet on Marvin Vettori. I've not actually placed one yet, but I think I'm leaning towards betting him, and I'm going to lay out some of the logic why I'm leaning towards him in a second. Definitely for DraftKings purposes, Rainmakers purposes, I prefer the Vettori side. 10 years younger than Cannonier. Marvin Vettori, 29 compared to 39 for Cannonier. That is something I think is going to catch up to Cannonier sooner rather than later. He's 39. He keeps himself in excellent physical condition. He doesn't have that much mileage on him, so it hasn't been an issue as of late. But one of these fights, Cannonier is going to show up. It's going to be like, oh, right, he's 39, 40 years old, and there's going to be a decline. I wouldn't be shocked if that ends up happening in this fight. In terms of the output, Vettori lands 4.38 significant strikes per minute to 4 for Jared Cannonier, so a little more output in the striking on Vettori's side, and he also absorbs a little bit less damage, 3.65 significant strikes absorbed per minute, compared to 3.86 for Cannonier. And then also, if somebody's going to be wrestling, I have to think it's going to be Marvin Vettori in this matchup. He lands 1.77 takedowns per 15 minutes, just 0.17 for Jared Cannonier. We never see Cannonier go to the wrestling. And also, better takedown defense on the Vettori side, 75% to 64%. So all of the metrics are in favor of Vettori here. And then he's also 10 years younger. That's why I'm going to be prioritizing him. I'm picking him to win most likely by decision. But if he's able to land takedowns here, I wouldn't be surprised to see him just dominate Jared Cannonier on the mat, especially if Cannonier's age starts to catch up with him at 39 years old. So I have, like I said, I have not officially bet on this fight yet. DraftKings purposes, I lean towards Vettori, but I think I'm going to end up betting Vettori. The one reason that I hadn't yet is I was a little bummed out that I missed the line earlier in the week where Vettori was minus 110. And then it started to swell like minus 115, minus 120. Now it's up to minus 125. I was hoping the line would go back the other way, but looks like it's not going to. Co-main event, Arman Tsarukyan taking on Joaquim Silva. And this is going to be, I think, hotly talked about leading up to this card for the main reason that Tsarukyan is massive favorite. Minus 1250 is the widest line on him. Oh, actually, I found one. Bet Rivers has him up at minus 1700 right now for Arman Tsarukyan. So yeah, massive favorite, and for good reason. Tsarukyan is, I think, one of the most talented young fighters in the lightweight division. I thought he should have won his last fight, 2 fights ago against Mateusz Gamrot. And if it was for him getting the nod, he'd be on a really big win streak and probably be in the discussion for a title shot right now. But we know that he's a massive favorite. We know he's probably going to win and score pretty well, especially because of the way that he fights. A lot of wrestling output, 3.3 takedowns landed per 15 minutes. He's fighting against somebody in Joaquim Silva who has suspect defensive wrestling and grappling. So there's a lot of upside for Tsarukyan to just go out and steamroll in this fight, land takedowns, get a quick submission. But he's $9,800 on DraftKings, and here's why I'm ultimately going to be underweight to the field to him. Our current projected ownership is 52.9% on Tsarukyan. He's expected to be the most popular fighter on the card. And at that price point and at that kind of ownership, I'm going to be underweight to him. It's not an outright fade, but when I was running lineups before this, I was getting to him in about 30% of my lineups as I'm checking on my other screen here, which is a good amount of exposure to Tsarukyan, but it still comes in well underweight to the field. So that's the way I'm leaning with Sarukian. There's a lot of high variance fights that I think have potential to score really well. So there's a scenario where Sarukian goes out, dominates, scores 115 DraftKings points, and that still wouldn't land him in the optimal lineup. So great safe play for cash games. I love him for Rainmakers. We don't have to consider any kind of salary, but for classic contests where he's $9,800, I'm going to undercut the field on a massively popular Arman Sarukian. Now, here's where the fight card gets pretty interesting, because there are so many fights that I think are super high variance where the winner is going to score well, but they're not a lot of spots where anybody's like a massive favorite and expected to score well. So, for instance, let's look at this Manuel Torres and Nicholas Mota fight, where this is currently around like Torres a minus 180 favorite and Mota a plus 150. But this fight is minus 160 to finish under 1.5 rounds. The reason is because of the fighting style of Manuel Torres, who comes out hot early, super explosive, striking, grappling, wrestling, everything he does it at 110% in the first 2 minutes of the fight, which means what? He ends up getting a lot of quick finishes, but when he doesn't get those quick finishes, if it doesn't materialize for Torres, he generally ends up getting tired, and then he's going to either lose the fight or get finished himself. So with that in mind, I think Nicholas Mota is a super live dog in this fight. He is one of the cheap fighters I'm going to be getting the most exposure to. He is just barely priced above 7K. He opens up a lot of opportunity on the high end for this fight, and there are a couple of high-end fighters I'm going to talk about in a second that I like getting to, and I expect him to come in lesser owned than Manuel Torres, especially for Rainmakers. I think Mota is a great target for Rainmakers, where Mota is also really cheap right now. At the time that I'm recording, you can get his rare cards for like $3. His core cards are less than $1. So I love the upside we're getting on Nicholas Mota, whereas Torres is super expensive right now for Rainmakers purposes. There's an obvious upside in Torres, and if you look at what we've seen from him so far, 2 UFC fights, landing 10.5 significant strikes per minute. But if Nicholas Mota is just able to survive the first 2 minutes, I think he ultimately ends up winning the fight. So I'm going to be getting more exposure to Mota. I think that he's a really good upside play with a little bit of leverage, particularly for Rainmakers purposes. Now, if we're talking about some of the high-end fighters to target, a few that I like, starting with Ronnie Lawrence. Ronnie Lawrence, when he wins, he scores bonkers points for DraftKings purposes. It's because of this wrestling upside. He lands 7.03 takedowns per 15 minutes. He got dominated in his last fight against Saidikov Kakramanov, but Saidikub Kakramanov. But with that said, Kakramanov is legit as hell. I cannot believe that he got cut from the UFC. I thought he was somebody who could have contended for a title at some point. And Kakramanov in his last fight that ultimately ended up getting him cut, he was winning against Said Nurmagomedov, then just gets caught and ends up getting finished in the second round of that fight. But I don't really see any shame in Ronnie Lawrence losing that fight to Kakramanov. And you look at the other fights from Ronnie Lawrence, 3 knockdowns against Mana Martinez and 6 takedowns. Against Vince Cachero, he landed 8 takedowns. Against Jose Johnson on the Contender Series, he landed 12 takedowns. So when Ronnie Lawrence wins fights, he puts up massive DraftKings scores. And that's why I like getting to him in this fight against Dan Argueta, especially when you consider that Argueta only is 50% takedown defense to this point in the UFC. So in the matchups we've seen Argueta in, he was taken down 2 times by Damon Jackson. He fought Nick Aguirre on short notice, and kind of a softball matchup for Dan Argueta. I don't think Nick Aguirre is really UFC material. And then also Argueta was fighting him on, if I remember correctly, it was like 3 or 4 days notice. But the loss against Damon Jackson was really not a great look for Argueta, especially when you consider that Damon Jackson was able to take him down a couple of times. If Damon Jackson's able to take down Argueta a couple of times, I think Ronnie Lawrence could just go to town with the takedowns in this spot. And I wouldn't be surprised to see him rack up 6, 7, 8 takedowns in this spot and put up a massive DraftKings score. So I like Ronnie Lawrence in this fight, and I love his upside for DK perspective. Other fighters on the high end that I think make a whole lot of sense, Teresa Bleda against Gabriela Fernandez. I wouldn't read too much into Bleda's last fight, which was a loss against Natalie Silva, because Silva's a fighter who could be fighting for a title in 2-3 years. She is a really, really high-end prospect, and it does look like odds makers are not all that concerned about the last fight either. Bleda is north of a minus 200 favorite, anywhere from like minus 225 to minus 250 right now. But where I think this fight could really be favorable from a fantasy perspective for Bleda is that we just saw Gabriela Fernandez taken down 4 times by Jasmine Jasdavicius. And I think that Bleda is a more aggressive and better wrestler than Jasudavicius, and also is a more potent finisher on the ground. So I would not be surprised to see Bleda, kind of similar to what I talked about with Ronnie Lawrence, where Gabriel Fernandez also only showed a 50% takedown defense in that matchup against Jasudavicius. We could see Bleda rack up takedowns early and get a finish. I think it's most likely to come via ground and pound. It could also possibly be from submission. But if we see Bleda get aggressive with the wrestling, which is typically what she does in her fights, I think there's big upside for a big score for her. So Bleda, she's really expensive at $9,500. So I don't necessarily love her for DraftKings Classic contest. For Rainmakers, though, she's going to be a primary target for me. If we look through some of the other fighters that are expensive to target, Alessandro Costa is another one that we should be considering. Jimmy Flick is somebody who's just really reliant on his grappling to end up getting wins. And if you look at his UFC fights to this point, he gets KO'd by Charles Johnson, and then his other 2 wins against Nate Smith on the Contender Series, submission, and a fight against Cody Durden where Jimmy Flick really didn't look good early, and then all of a sudden flying triangle, and he ends up winning the fight. But Alessandro Costa, I think, is probably a better grappler than Jimmy Flick. He's also a much better striker. He has a ton of power in his hands. I think Costa wins this fight no matter where it goes. He might even be able to take down Jimmy Flick and land some pretty significant ground and pound there. So another fighter who's really expensive in Alessandro Costa, but I think that at lower ownership, both him and Bleda do make for decent pivots off of Arman Tsarukyan, because once again, looking at our projected ownership, I said we've got Tsarukyan projected for right around 53% ownership, but then Bleda and Costa, we both have projected for around 20% ownership, with all of that ownership going towards Tsarukyan on the high end. So if you want to get to a pivot and somebody who's about half of the ownership of Tsarukyan, I think both Bleda and Costa make for pretty good options. Now, if we're looking through some other fights that I think have a lot of boom-bust potential, where I think the winner should score really well, Pat Sabatini against Lucas Almeida, wrestler versus grappler matchup. Whenever we get these sorts of matchups, it's whoever is able to impose their game plan typically scores really well. If Pat Sabatini is able to land takedowns, I expect him to land them in mass. Sabatini lands 3.75 takedowns per 15 minutes. Almeida only has a 50% takedown defense. Sabatini be live for a submission too, because I think he's a better submission grappler who's able to get top control. But if Sabatini's not able to land the takedowns, he's probably going to get knocked out by Almeida, because Almeida is a very dangerous striker. He lands 6.6 significant strikes per minute, and Sabatini has a very suspect chin. We just saw Pat Sabatini get knocked out by Damon Jackson, which is a horrendous look for Pat Sabatini, because Damon Jackson has almost no power in his hands at all. We've also seen Pat Sabatini get hurt really bad in the Jamal Emmers fight. And that was a fight where he gets hurt, nearly finished, and then he's able to land a heel hook, is able to really blow out Jamal Emmers' knee. And that's how he's able to come back to win that fight. But I expect the winner to score extremely well here. I'm going to be about even on both sides when it comes to Sabatini and Almeida. Almeida's a very live dog. He's a good source of salary savings. And then Sabatini, if he wins, I expect him to score really well on the high end as well. As for just running through some of the other fights on the card, my least favorite fights to target, Zach Pauga against Modestas Bukauskas, 2 fairly low output strikers. I don't think that fight is going to score particularly well. Same for Muslim Salikov against Nicholas Dalby. Short of a quick finish for Salikov, which he has done in the past, he has such low output in his fights. Same with Nicholas Dalby. If we look at the significant strike stats here, 3.3 significant strikes landed per minute for Salikov, 3.74 for Dalby. I don't expect there to be a lot of wrestling or grappling in this fight. So short of an early finish by Salikov, I do think this is another fight that is just not all that appealing from a DraftKings perspective. And yeah, that really wraps up my primary targets, though. Once again, main event, I like the Vettori Cannonier. I prefer the Vettori side. And then some other fights that are ones that are really high priorities for me to target. Ronnie Lawrence is going to be a core play for me this week. And then also Alessandro Costa and Teresa Bleda as pivots off of Arman Tsarukyan in classic contest. One more bet that I want to talk about, Denise Bondar against Carlos Hernandez. Bondar's fought really low-level competition, so it's kind of hard to know what to make of how he stacks up in the UFC. His one fight that he had in the UFC was against Malcolm Gordon. Frankly, Bondar didn't look great, but the fight only lasted a minute and a half, and he ended up having like a fluke broken arm/elbow injury. So I don't know. We don't really have all that much data on Bondar. Other than this, he has had 20 pro fights, and 19 of them have finished inside the distance. So I do think this is a pretty good fight to target in the mid-range. I do think Bondar has more upside because of his ability to wrestle and the fact that we've seen Carlos Hernandez taken down in fights in the past. So I do think Bondar could have wrestling success. But here's what I like about this from a betting perspective. Like I just mentioned, 20 career fights for Bondar, 19 of them finished inside the distance. And this fight is currently plus 140 for the under 2.5 rounds. It is also plus 125 to finish inside the distance. Those are the best odds for both of those respectively at the time that I'm recording. I think both of those are good bets considering the history of Bondar and how he fights. Really aggressive, looks for finishes, a lot of wrestling and grappling. I think he could get Carlos Hernandez to the ground and finish him there. I also think there's potential for Bondar to get stretched, get exhausted in this fight, and Carlos Hernandez to finish him late. So a fight that I like targeting for DFS purposes, but for betting purposes, I do like this fight to finish inside the distance, and that's one of my favorite bets of the slate. Let's go ahead and look at Rainmakers now. I'll build out an elite lineup here. Let's see. Here we go. So 5 fighters started. We don't have to worry about any kind of salary cap here, which is why for me, especially for safety, I'm going to play one of my Sarukians here in the captain spot. I think that's a pretty easy call for me. I'm going to have to play one other elite card. I'll look at Marvin Vettori because I'm picking him to win the main event. So I've got 2 elites in here, and now I could round out my elite lineup with 3 rares, and I'll just go with the other ones. Very bummed, by the way, that Jalga Zhumagulov, another fight canceled. His fight better hold up next week. I want to see the haircut in action. All right, other fighters. Teresa Bleda, I think she has a lot of upside as a big favorite. I'll put Ronnie Lawrence in here. Do I want to target the Mota Torres fight, or do I want to go a little bit? I'll go a little bit safer and put Alessandro Costa in here. I like this lineup. I think this is a pretty good-looking one. Got Sarukian, got exposure to the main event, and then Bleda, Ronnie Lawrence, Alessandro Costa. Let's lock it in. All right, there we go. And if you guys want to go check out Rainmakers, like I said, there's a link below. Get you a totally free starters pack for the PGA Rainmakers product. If you guys haven't done yet, do me a favor, like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you want to check out Chalkboard, it is a totally free to download app. I post some additional bets in there, answer some questions, sweat some bets with you guys. There's a link for that below, and it's totally for free. So go check that out as well. But other than that, guys, thank you very much for watching. I hope you have a great weekend, and good luck with the slate tomorrow.